Hey guys, welcome to World Geography and Culture 6. This is the May 7th, 2020 lesson, and as always, this lesson is a Shields and Yuteslers production. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to check in, we're going to warm up, we're going to read a story and watch a short film, and then we are going to read an article and answer some questions. Before I go on, how do you like my little compass rose agenda? Isn't that cute? All right, this unit is Unit 7. We are in Unit 7 looking specifically at sub-Saharan Africa. What do we talk about when we talk about Africa is the question that we are thinking about as our overarching question for today. And our objective is students will be able to identify ways in which Africa is incorrectly generalized by creating very specific questions about different and distinct places in Africa. So for our warm-up, I'm going to ask you, what is the language of a continent? I've given you a bunch of languages, all of which ask the question, how are you? It's translated into several languages. Which one of these do you believe is Africa's main language? Why do you think so? Also, remembering what we have learned, which language is Europe's main language? Why do you think that is? Answer those in the warm-up slide. All right, now you have an opportunity to judge your teachers. Why do you think we asked you to tell us the primary language in Africa and then the primary language in Europe? What is the problem in asking those questions? Can you answer them with the information that's in the question? So as I've said, today's lesson is going to be us really thinking about how we speak when we speak about Africa. We need to remember that it is a continent, a whole continent, and not a country. And if you have to say that to yourself 15 times today, then that's what you need to do. Africa is a continent, a whole continent, and not a country. So I've given you a quote by someone who pretty famously talks about this concept of Africa being more complex than just one little stereotype. And she says, if you followed the media, you'd think that everybody in Africa was starving to death. And that's not the case. So it's important to engage with the other Africa. And if you want, you can, as a student, look up the Chimamanda Adichie TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, to hear more about her ideas on this subject. So there's a tradition in Africa of storytellers learning the stories of families or tribes going back many, many generations. We're going to practice that a little bit today, that concept of an oral tradition, a storyteller telling a story. And the thing is, when the storyteller tells his or her story, if he or she is leaving information out, if the audience feels like, I'm missing something here, they will interject and they'll say, hey, where is that? Who is that? Why? What is happening? To get more information from the storyteller, to remind him that he's missed a step. So we can't do that because we're not in the same room, but what we can do is have you notice, highlight when I use the term Africa in a story to represent more of Africa than I mean to. So you have just listened to the directions. Step 2, read along with me as I read the story aloud. Step 3, highlight every time I use the term Africa in the story to represent more of Africa than I mean to do. And then step 4, you're going to write a reflection of this experience. So the story. As I sat down to breakfast this morning, I poured myself a bowl of Cocoa Puffs and thought of what my geography teacher had talked about in class yesterday. Much of the chocolate we eat is from Africa. While eating, I picked up the newspaper and discovered that the president will be traveling to France, China, and Africa in upcoming months. My father drove me to school, and he, as always, listened to the news on the radio. I heard that in the countryside of Africa, famine and ethnic conflict continue to be a major concern. In geography class today, we had an African guest speaker. I asked him why it was always so hot in Africa. One of my friends said that when her family traveled to Africa, her mother had worried about tropical diseases in Africa. Later that day, in science class, we talked about nuclear energy and learned that Africa has large deposits of uranium used in creating energy. After school, I relaxed in front of the television watching old movies on Nickelodeon and drinking a Coke. I remembered my geography teacher having said that the cola flavor comes from cola nut trees grown in Africa. I watched an old Tarzan movie and wondered about the African jungle. I also thought about what our guest speaker had said today. Africa is so diverse that it is hard to make generalizations about this continent. On the next slide, I'm going to ask you to reflect on what you learned from the experience of questioning my uses of the term Africa in this story about Africa. What did this exercise help you realize? Just to check with you, if you were reading along with me and highlighting every time, you really should have gotten more information from me about Africa than the term Africa. You would have noticed me saying Africa all of these times. How many did you get?